Hi everyone, I'm Stan Mallow, the Paranormal Yacker. My guest in today's show is Marc Hartzman. He has authored several books, including The Big Book of Mars. ABC.com has referred to him as one of America's leading connoisseurs of the bizarre. What I'll be talking with Marc about is his book, We Are Not Alone, The Extraordinary History of UFOs and Aliens Invading Our Hopes, Fears, and Fantasies. Marc Hartzman, welcome to Paranormal Yacker.
Thanks, Stan. Appreciate you having me on.
You, Marc, begin We Are Not Alone, relating your visit, or should I say, as you do, your pilgrimage to Roswell, New Mexico, a city that's considered by many as the epic center, the Bethlehem, the birthplace of modern day ufology. What was your reason for doing that?
Well, I'm going to write a book on UFOs. Definitely got to go to Roswell. I was actually looking forward to that as part of the research for the project. It worked out great. I was actually went to visit a friend who has a massive UFO archive, David Marler, and worked with him for a while, going through his materials. And then I was planning to take my trip up to Roswell, took that 3-hour drive. And Roswell was amazing. I mean, I love the fact that the town's completely embraced this particular history. It's got lampposts with alien heads, and there's a Dunkin' Donuts being held up, the sign with an alien. McDonald's is shaped like a flying saucer. Like it's just everywhere. Everywhere. Signs like banks are welcoming Earthlings, all this kind of fun stuff. So they've completely embraced that culture. But it was great to go to the museum and research center there. They've got thousands of files. It's extraordinary how much is there. And just going through collecting what I could. One of the more amazing experiences I had there was actually meeting with a man. I wrote about this in the introduction to We Are Not Alone. And I met with a guy who actually David Marther introduced me to. He said, "Oh, if you're going to Roswell, you should meet with this guy." His name's Charles Davis. And he had an experience when he was 8 years old back in 1964. It was great to meet up with him for lunch and hear his story of this very strange experience he had. He didn't call it a UFO. He said something weird happened to him. It was never explained, but basically a top-shaped craft kind of flew over his head while he was outside playing in his grandmother's parking lot of her laundromat that she owned. And this thing just kind of went back and forth with him a little bit, kind of almost like mirroring his movements, flies over his head, shoots down fire, burns him from the chin up. He gets rushed to the hospital and treated immediately. His grandmother saw the whole thing and helped him out right away, and was investigated by the FBI, written up in newspapers. No one found any explanation for what this thing was. There was no evidence left behind, nothing else that seemed like it could cause the fire. Very, very strange case. Oddly enough, over the months that followed, other top-shaped crafts were being spotted, usually on Tuesday nights, which is even weirder. To me, that was like a great sort of weird, odd, unexplainable story to set up the whole book.
You, Marc, are not just a skilled writer and historian, but a keen observer of everything you see, read, and hear. That being the case, I was wondering what criteria you used when writing the history of UFOs to separate fact from fiction and deciding if someone you were interviewing was telling you the truth or not.
That's a good question. First of all, there's so many cases, thousands of cases. Obviously, Project Blue Book alone had over 12,000 cases. Part of the challenge is figuring out which stories do I tell, which stories do I not tell. In a book like this, I want this to be a good book for someone new to the phenomena, but also someone who's been a bit experienced with it and read a little bit about it already. So there's kind of a mix of known stories like Roswell and Kenneth Arnold, and other stories that are much more lesser known, like the one I just mentioned. I think there's a good balance of that. So that was one thing I was really sort of seeking out, trying to decide what to include, what not to include. In terms of interviews, I tried to choose people I would feel comfortable talking with, I thought would have interesting stories. I'm trying not to really judge. I'm just trying to present information. If quotes might sound, to some people, they might sound outlandish. That's fine. This is that person's story. This is what they believe happened to them. And that's how I present it. So I'm not trying to say that this person is lying to me or not, but I might present counter evidence to a particular case. So I can maybe show both sides of something. And that kind of helps determine, let the reader determine, does this seem like it's real, or does maybe this other explanation might be a more valid reason for what this person saw or experienced. It really varies case by case, but for the most part, I will say there weren't a lot of people I didn't think people were lying to me. I'll say that. I never felt that.
When it comes to alien abductions, that which was experienced by Betty and Barney Hill is probably the most well-known and documented one, thanks to their niece, Kathleen Martin. That abduction, along with others, is profiled in your book. What, Mark, can you tell me about the Betty and Barney Hill abduction?
It's a pretty interesting case for sure. This was 1961. First really well-known American abduction case. I did write about one that happened earlier, but that wasn't really made public until many years later. But Betty and Barney Hill, this happened while they were driving through New Hampshire. They see this sort of flying saucer UFO craft off the side of the road. It's a very empty road through the mountains. They get out to investigate, or Barney does at least. He gets back in the car, they drive on. This thing is to be following them. They're hearing strange noises. They get out and they investigate again. This time, at some point, they run into these beings and they're abducted. They're taken aboard. This is all coming out later, of course. They're taken aboard this spacecraft. They each have their own unique experiences, both of which are somewhat invasive, and they're released eventually. Betty actually has an interaction with one of the crew members of this craft and is shown what's called the star map, which is showing kind of like a 3D, almost like, I imagine it was almost like a hologram type image that she was seeing. Again, this was early 60s. And she's seeing a star map of the galaxy. They're trying to explain where they're from. So she witnesses this whole thing. She actually wanted to take a souvenir. They were going to give her a book, which would have been, how amazing would that have been if we actually had some physical evidence like that to bring back. But they took it back at the last minute, so she didn't get to keep the souvenir. But they get back to their car, they go home. By the time they get home, they've realized that they've lost a few hours of their lives. They can't try to understand at that point where those hours went. All these memories I just described, these didn't come out until later through hypnotic regression sessions. So they start feeling some strange things happening. They're noticing strange things around their car and physically as well. Memories are starting to come back a little bit. And that's when they go and meet with a hypnotist and start having these sessions. The sessions reveal these stories that seem to be aligning with each other. They're remarkable. The place on a star map where Betty was told that these beings were from was later investigated by an astronomer who claimed to have said that this map seemed to be accurate in terms of where planetary system might be. I do talk about in the book later, she ended up saying that maybe she was wrong about that, but this is all sort of part of the interesting story of Betty and Barney Hill. By the end of it, the hypnotist essentially believes what they're saying, but he wasn't exactly convinced that they were definitely abducted. But he does feel that they feel this way truthfully, that they think this is what happened to them. No one knows for sure. I know that Kathleen's done a lot of research into it, and she's had different pieces investigated. I know part of Betty's dress was investigated. I talk a little bit about that in the book. There's certainly some interesting questions about that.
There are references in the Bible of UFOs and astronauts. Where in the Bible are they mentioned and what is written about them?
I would say probably the most significant one is the Ezekiel's vision, which I actually had written quite a bit about initially. We edited a little bit when we were trimming the book during our edits. That's where Ezekiel saw this chariot coming down from the heavens with these strange circular, these wheels sort of spinning oddly kind of within each other. This creature seated upon what was like almost like a throne with different kinds of faces, look like different creatures. The whole thing just sounds like people looking through a modern day lens look back and say, oh, that sounds like it was a UFO sighting, but he was describing it in the language he had at the time. Obviously, he didn't have that kind of vocabulary. That's one thought. Personally, I think that people say, oh, that was God coming down the chariot. I don't know how that's any stranger than it being an alien. Like, both are extraterrestrial, right? Either are living here on the planet. Something came down from the heavens. That's certainly odd one way or the other. The question becomes, did he actually see this as the story? How accurate is the story? Were there other things going on at the time that maybe led to his descriptions? No one knows for sure, but it's definitely an interesting story to look back at and question and wonder, like, have they been here for as long as humanity has? It's one of those classic stories that raises that question.
Ancient alien architects have been credited with building many of the world's most magnificent structures. This includes the Great Pyramids of Egypt. Do you, Mark, know the reasons people give when they say that?
I would say that people say that because they look back and they wonder, how is it possible that with the limited technology available at that time, could humans have created such a structure? And there are definitely examples where you look at it and you say, how, some of these stones, for example, could be several tons. How could they possibly have moved that? The size of them, the height, the width, how is it possible they could move those to places where they were too, where it would appear that there was no easy way to get them there, or that they would have to push these stones a great distance? That makes them wonder, was there some extraterrestrial technology that helped them achieve this? In a lot of cases, I think it's a valid question. It's definitely interesting. The pyramids, I wrote about that a bit. There are theories of how they could have moved some of these stones. There was another piece of the Nile that actually at one point did go by where some of these pyramids were. So floating on rafts or boats, it could have actually been a little bit easier than we might have thought, not realizing that there was a waterway passage there. There are different theories that people have, scientists have looked at, and they say, well, they could have done this, they could have done that. It's feasible that human ingenuity could have actually done these things. I don't think we should underestimate the power of human ingenuity. I also tend to think personally that if aliens visited at that time to help us, I feel like there would have been something more left behind from them. If they have the technology and the intelligence to get here, why do they 100% rely on resources here on Earth? I look at what we're doing, for example, on Mars right now. We have machines on Mars right now. Before we send humans there, we'll 3D print habitats for ourselves. We'll have it prepared for us before we actually get there. I know I'm looking through it the lens of what we know now, but I do wonder if another intelligent civilization would have done something similar or left something similar behind. Just my own theory.
When asked if there is scientific evidence that supports the existence of extraterrestrial intelligence, many ufologists will say yes, and to prove it, they invariably mention the WOW radio signal. What, Mark, can you tell me about that signal?
The WOW signal was from the late 1970s. This came from the Big Ear Observatory in Ohio. This was where they were doing radio astronomy to search for extraterrestrial intelligence. They're pointing the radio telescopes, trying to find signals. They're receiving signals throughout the day and night, leaving data on papers printing out. One night, late at night, a signal comes in and the numbers are kind of off the charts. Like 1, 2, 3 were kind of normal levels. This had 4s, 5s, 6s, and it went into letters. Once you get into letters, you're really getting up there. When this stack of data was delivered to one of the scientists who was investigating this and researching with the observatory, sees this anomaly, he circles it, and he writes, wow, with an exclamation point in the margin. That's why it's called the wow signal. So they're thinking like, wow, I just said myself, could this actually be it? Is this an extraterrestrial message? Or is this their hello from somewhere afar, right? There was some excitement, of course. They're trying to replicate it. They can't find another signal like this that's not coming in again at all. There's a lot of question like, okay, well, was this something or was it some kind of anomaly? Was it a glitch of some sort? You can't really find proof either way. There wasn't enough data ultimately to confirm that this was extraterrestrial in origin. But at the same time, there wasn't exactly an explanation for what it was. To this day, it remains a bit of a mystery. I think there are some, like you said, who are in the camp of, yes, that's evidence of extraterrestrial. Many scientists say we need more data to confirm that. We couldn't replicate it. This isn't enough to make any kind of confirmation. It's definitely one of those interesting blips of radio astronomy. When I spoke to like Seth Shostak at SETI, he was not convinced this was anything. He said there's been other blips like that as well, but until you get something I think that's a bit more solid, they're not going to say anything just yet.
The cover-ups and conspiracies around UFOs and alien beings are undoubtedly in the hundreds of thousands or even in the millions. Included in those numbers has to be, for sure, the Roswell incident in Area 51. Could you, Mark, give me one cover-up and one conspiracy that stands out in your mind for each of them?
Roswell is such an interesting case because this happened in early July 1947. This was just weeks after Kenneth Arnold, when the term flying saucer first came into our lexicon. From that day on, people started reporting flying saucers or flying discs, as they also called them. It was really picking up a lot of momentum. And of course, one crashes in Roswell, and the newspaper actually says Roswell Army Airfield had recovered a flying disc. That was the actual headline, was they recovered a flying disc, which is amazing. Like you can imagine what that must have been like to read that in the papers. This was a press release that came from the Army. The next day, of course, they retracted it and said it was actually a weather balloon. That's where the conspiracy begins because the story faded away. After a few days, that was it. People moved on. Then there were other UFO sightings, and Project Blue Book investigated those. No one really talked much about Roswell. You won't find it really in any books. It's mentioned, I think, in like one book in the 60s. I think it was UFOs or flying saucers are serious business, if I remember correctly. But it's like, again, it's a blip. It's not until the late 70s when the ufologist and physicist Stanton Friedman is researching some cases and is informed about some people in Roswell he should talk to, and kind of uncovers a lot more information about what was going on back then. He interviews lots of people who were around and who experienced things, whether it was radio, someone at a radio station who was getting information from someone and being told not to pass it on, and people who said they saw alien beings being picked up and carted away. Just, all these things are coming out. That's where the Roswell mythology and lore really comes from, is these stories 30 years later, which is fascinating because these people swore by what they saw and what they remembered. We had these firsthand accounts 30 years away. So then the question is how accurate are those memories from 30 years ago? The government eventually came out and said that this was Project Mogul, which was a high altitude secret mission to spy on the Soviets and their nuclear program. It was so secret that they covered up that with a UFO story, which I personally find kind of amusing, that normally you think of a story covering up a UFO story, but here they used a UFO story to cover up their own secret program. And I think they realized that wasn't such a good idea. So that's kind of where that whole conspiracy comes from. Then the question is, it's like, okay, well, it's Project Mogul just more BS? This really was a spacecraft. Now you're just telling us more weather balloon stuff to sweep it under the rug and make us think that nothing happened. I did speak with a scientist, and I love this story. I wrote about this in the book. He actually has a theory that gave a terrestrial explanation for pretty much everything people said they saw at Roswell, which was, like I said, they thought they saw bodies being carried away, which would have been described as small, sort of grayish creatures, kind of like what's behind you, to be honest. Long limbs, big head, gray skin, kind of short, and then the debris, of course. And so he thought, well, maybe what was going on is that they were doing the high altitude testing, and they would wanted to check biological responses, what is a high altitude biological response on the human body. To do that, they may have been using monkeys. I did see that at least, I think in early 48, at least it was documented that they were testing monkeys in high altitude test in New Mexico, the Roswell area. So they would have shaved their fur and then put, electrodes on them and everything to measure their biometrics. You can imagine a shaved monkey would look a bit like, not too unlike what's behind you there, that alien, especially if you never seen anything like that before. Long limbs, short, big head, gray skin, the whole thing. They may have also been trying to train them to take pictures over the Soviets with a camera. That would be something that would be beneficial. You didn't have the technology to do that remotely at that point, but you could have a monkey pushing a button and being rewarded for the behavior with a banana chip or whatever it might be. Those were all things that were going on at that time. Mylar was a new material. People were finding a metal material that seemed strange. That may have seemed extraterrestrial. I thought that was an interesting explanation. Granted, some people say that the metal was able to be folded and unfold itself, reform its own position, which is something certainly a little bit more out of this world. Which do you choose to believe? I think that's probably a bigger answer to that particular question than you asked for, but I love those stories. Area 51 is fascinating as well. I mean, the big story there is in the late 80s, an engineer named Bob Lazar came out and said that they were back engineering flying saucers that were extraterrestrial nature at Area 51. He was actually at a division called S4, but this is what he said he saw, and they had documents about it, literature he was reading about this. And he broke the story on the news station in Las Vegas with George Knapp. This has been a story ever since. He's held on to that story since the late 80s. He's never wavered on it. That's the big question is, are they hiding something there? Granted, Area 51 is where they were testing high altitude planes back in the early 50s, the U-2, for example. They were trying to cover up what those were because these were flying at heights that no one had ever seen before, unlike any kind of conventional aircraft. People thought that was something from another planet potentially. The government didn't want them to know what it was, so they would have Area 51 cover up those stories. So there's always been a bit of a cover-up associated because of the secretive nature of the technology being worked on there.
There have been reports circulating for some time about UFOs being seen flying over U.S. nuclear weapon sites. What, Mark, can you tell me about them, such as the reason people believe alien beings are interested in those sites? And is it known how the military is responding or plans to respond to the alien crafts?
I talked about several of these cases that happened in the mid 1960s. I went to visit with a few of these retired Air Force captains. They were doing a talk at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. a few years ago when I was doing research for the book. I went to hear their talks, and I met with Robert Salas, who was leading this group of retired captains. And they'd all had these experiences at different Air Force bases or nuclear sites. They're incredible stories. Robert Salas, for example, his was in Montana, and there had been a sighting of a UFO overhead, and he was going in for a shift, and he worked underground where the controls were for these 10 ICBMs that were there. And these 10 ICBMs all went offline when that UFO was reported overhead. He described how for one ICBM to go offline, it would have to be a really crazy glitch for something like that to happen. This was Malmstrom, by the way, was the name of the base. We said that each of them were individual. They weren't connected. For 10 to go offline simultaneously, it's not like one goes off and the other nine go off with it. They'd all have to have a crazy glitch happening at the exact same time. So for one to be a completely rare experience, you imagine 10 at once, just seemed to be no explanation for it. And then they came back on. This happened. It also happened to 10 at another base nearby about 10 days earlier. So what was going on here that caused these ICBMs to go offline? These things happened in other places. There were instances of UFOs seen over sites in Russia as well, causing concerns and issues. In terms of what the military has done about it, well, they didn't do anything about it back then. No one wanted to listen to what Salas had to say at that point. He's only now, in the past few years, really been very vocal about it. It came up at a congressional hearing, I think in May of 2022. One of the representatives or senators asked about it, and the two men from the UAP task force had basically act like they'd never heard of Malmstrom before, which was interesting. And they said, well, we hadn't been asked to look into it. And this representative said, well, I'm asking you now, go look into it, which was interesting. It was now part of the public record, and it was being formally asked to be investigated. I haven't heard anything more about that since then, but I did think it was interesting that it finally was getting some attention to be looked into. What's interesting about the fact that these sightings have happened is it makes you wonder, are we having some sort of extraterrestrials look after us in some way, showing us a show of power to say, hey, we can turn off your nuclear weapons in the blink of an eye if we want to? That's certainly a sign of power. Maybe it's also just here to protect us. A lot of the UFO theories early on, like the reason that people believe they started in the late 1940s is because there was concerns about the atomic age after World War II. Maybe they were coming here to warn us. Maybe they were worried about us destroying other parts of the solar system or the galaxy. So they were concerned about damage. That kind of falls in line with that line of thinking. Who knows for sure what exactly is going on, but definitely very interesting stories. All these men who spoke were very convincing and adamant about what they experienced. There was no doubt in their mind that this is what was going on and what they experienced. It makes you wonder why they would make anything like this up.
After decades of cover-ups and denials, the US government has finally admitted that UFOs, UAPs are real. However, they claim they don't know what or who they are. According to your research and contacts, Mark, are they telling us the truth, or do they know what and who they are, but they're just not telling us?
We don't know that answer for sure. That's one thing. But it is amazing that they've acknowledged that there are unidentified aerial phenomena. That acknowledgement alone, that basically there is something flying through our US airspace that they can't identify. To me, that's a pretty big admission, because you want to think that our defense forces are able to protect us from anything. Why is it that there's things that you can't identify? What is it? And so all this kind of came about in 2017 when the news was broken about these UAPs and Navy pilots who've been seeing things before. And that was reported by the New York Times, and video was released from some of these Navy pilots. I'm sure your viewers have probably seen these. This is pretty well known. But I did speak with Christopher Mellon and Lou Elizondo, who were behind that. Christopher Mellon thought it was really a matter of national defense to find out what these things were. And so he was able to release those videos to the Times and later, I think, the Washington Post. So people started taking it seriously. It wasn't so much of the sensationalism of earlier UFO stories. In fact, they changed the terminology from UFO to UAP just to try to shed that stigma. Lou Elizondo, who was part of that secret group, ATIP, who was investigating this, he told me that he's seen things that none of us could imagine and that were very convincing. Of course, I asked him if he could tell me about those, and he said no, still classified. He can't speak about it. He was very convinced by what he personally had seen, that there was something else out there, trying to understand what that might be. Certainly, there's discussions of whether or not things like the Tic Tac UFO or UAP are advanced technology from foreign adversaries. I don't think that's the case. I feel like if it is, we'd be in trouble. I also feel that a lot of those movements and descriptions go back to sightings from decades past, when certainly no technology on this planet existed like that. Something's out there. We know that much, and the government's acknowledged that, which is fascinating. Hopefully we'll get answers soon. What gives me hope about getting answers is that we do have, I mentioned the stigma being shed. Now we have scientists actually seriously investigating it. I spoke with Avi Loeb, who's the head of Harvard Science Department and runs the Galileo Project. And so he's got scientists working with him. He's got funding, he's got clout, he's got the know-how, he's got the resources. So they're collecting their own data now. As he says, the sky is unclassified. He's not going to wait for the government to release data. He's going to get it himself. That gives me hope that within a few years, maybe he'll get enough data to actually understand or find something and identify it.
What, Mark, would you like to see as the next chapter in the world of UFOs, UAPs, and mankind's desire to connect with alien beings?
I'd love to see some undeniable evidence. It would be great. Like we hear talk about recovered spacecraft. It'd be great to see it, have that out there. If it's there, where did it come from? Can we find that out? I think making contact, if something is here, to me, it would be extraordinary to make contact. That would be a major event in human history, if not, maybe the most major event in human history, to know that we're not alone. And what could we learn? That to me would be the exciting thing, is what could we learn that could benefit humankind, make life better here, maybe help us expand humanity elsewhere. That would be amazing.
Agree. If you, Mark, were given the opportunity to board a spacecraft and were told you could be taken to any planet in our solar system, which one would you choose and why?
They're all terrible. Having written a lot about Mars for the Big Book of Mars, I know that it's not friendly to humans at all. It's a terrible place. I guess I should caveat your question. If they take me there, am I protected in some way to at the surface if I were to land there, or we're just doing a flyby? If it's a flyby, I would love to see Mars personally because I've written so much about it. So Mars has a special place in my heart. I'm fascinated by it and its history, the lore of Mars within human culture. I love. I would personally love to be able to see that. I just want to make sure I'm not going to die in a split second because of the dangers there between, particularly with the atmosphere and the pressure. Very unkind to humans. But they'll work on ways to be able to survive when we get there.
Should viewers of Paranormal Yacker want to buy We Are Not Alone, The Extraordinary History of UFOs and Aliens Invading Our Hopes, Fears, and Fantasies, or any of your other books, how can they do that?
They're all available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble. You can go to bookshop.org. I have a website, markhartzmanbooks.com, MARC. The books are all filled with lots of imagery, beautiful books, all of them. I hope that your viewers will check it out. We Are Not Alone just came out in October. It's coming out on audiobook at the end of February, so I'm excited about that. It should be in all bookstores as well.
And my next question to you is about your website, since your love of the unusual and bizarre can be found on it, and you gave it out. I was going to ask you about it. People should check it out. It's cool.
Yes. I have another site as well called weirdhistorian.com, which is exactly what it says. It's filled with weird history, UFO, paranormal, all sorts of fun stuff there too.
Marc Hartzman, I thank you for being my guest on Paranormal Yacker. Yakking with you has been a truly out of this world experience.
Well, thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Hi, everyone. This is Stan Mallow, the Paranormal Yacker. I hope you enjoyed the interview you just watched. So that you don't miss any upcoming shows, be sure to subscribe to my free YouTube channel. To do that, just press the subscribe button on your screen.